We're going to jump right back in with a fireside chat on a very timely and important topic: the perils of social media and the state of our digital world, and lessons from Netflix's documentary, The Social Dilemma. Please join me in welcoming two experts who appeared in that film, Anna Lembke and Randy Fernando, and they'll be chatting with Guy Pearce from Convergence. Over to you.
Thank you, Jay. On behalf of Convergence.Tech, the organizing committee, and our participants, a big thank you to our special guests, Anna and Randy, for joining us today. Social media, friend and foe, or is that friend or foe? For many, living without the benefits of social media is unimaginable. These benefits include staying connected with friends, family, and colleagues, meeting new acquaintances using tools like Facebook or LinkedIn or WhatsApp or Instagram or Snapchat or Twitter. That list extends. In other parts of the world, you could have tools like RenRen or WeChat or Qzone or Baidu or YY. Certainly a huge diversity of tools out there. Maybe you enjoy the benefits of engaging in discussion using tools like Quora and Dig, or you like access to information and content discovery using tools like YouTube and Pinterest and Reddit. Or maybe you enjoy civic engagement and fundraising using a combination of all of the above together with tools like Patreon or Indiegogo. Or maybe you like informal publishing on tools like Tumblr and Medium. Or what about creating or looking up consumer reviews on tools like Yelp, Zomato, and TripAdvisor? And then what about those social networks for connecting with people with common interests like Goodreads and Last.fm? Or if you're into fashion, what about those social shopping networks like Polyvore or Etsy or Fancy for all on the latest shopping tips and fashion trends? And then it gets bad. There are those anonymous social networks like Whisper, like Ask.fm, like After School, who some say are simply places for consequence-free cyberbullying. Excluding the anonymous social networks, I think we are all very aware that each of the benefits we love so much comes at some sort of non-financial cost. As we know, pretty much for a large part, they are financially free of charge unless you choose some kind of advanced service. However, we're not always sure of the nature of those non-financial costs. One of those costs is privacy. Another is the impact of social media on our brains. And at an even larger scale, there's also the impact of social media on our societies. Just taking a brief look at privacy, for example, how many times have you personally clicked on that accept cookies button at the bottom of a site you visit? Do you know what you're giving away? Do you even go and look at what you're giving away to receive that benefit? How many times at the back of your mind have you thought, wow, I'm clicking on this, but actually there's no alternative. If I don't click on this, I don't get the benefit, and no one is offering me an alternative. Is that really a choice? Is that really consent? And this is the space of a topical area called privacy beyond compliance, which is something totally different, but it starts to look at the things that organizations need to do and how they address ethics where the law is silent on the matter. As mentioned, the two other costs of social media we want to explore is the impact of social media on our brains and on our social fabric. And here to help us understand the impact of social media on our brains and on our social fabric are Anna and Randy. Welcome. So with that said, let's start with you, Anna. Anna, from an individual perspective, what are your views on the good and the bad of social media?
Well, Guy, I'm so happy that you phrased the question like that, because I think it's really important to point out there are so many good things about social media, right? It's wonderful that we can make these connections all around the world, many of them very positive, very deep, and very meaningful. But it's also essential that we begin this discussion about the dark side of social media. And what I want to talk about is specifically what social media can do to your brain. So our brains have been evolutionarily designed over millions of years to make us connect with other people, because connection is how we stay safe when there's danger. Connection is how we find a mate to procreate the species. And what we know is that when we make those social connections, we get a little release of something called dopamine in our brain's reward pathway. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, which is a chemical inside of our brains that makes us feel pleasure. And we feel dopamine release and feel pleasure when other people like us, when they praise us, and when they agree with us. And that's what motivates us to go out and make these human connections. But the problem with social media is that even without making very much effort at all, we can make these kinds of connections that release a whole lot more dopamine in our brain than typical natural human interactions will. Because the truth is that real life human connections are complicated, they're messy, they're not always reinforcing, we don't always get alike. Also, we got to go out there and actually find the people. But on social media, we have access to millions of people all over the world who can like us. And let me tell you, when that happens, we get a huge release of dopamine in our brains. And Guy, the big difference between a substance or behavior that's addictive and one that isn't is that addictive behaviors release a lot more dopamine. So when we're engaging in social media, we can have a huge hit of dopamine. And by the way, these apps are designed to release dopamine. They're designed to keep us engaged. Even when we want to stop, they chase us down and keep us going with things that we know, that they know we like. So over time, with repeated engagement with these high dopamine social media apps, what happens is we develop something called tolerance. Tolerance is when you need more and more of a drug to get the same effect. So all of a sudden, just a picture of ourselves isn't enough. Now we have to have a video of ourselves. Then we have to have a video of ourselves doing something really dangerous in order for other people to get excited about it, or for us to get excited about what they're doing. So basically, we're always trying to chase a more potent version of the drug. And the more that we do that, that is, ingest these high dopamine social media products, the more our own brain says, you know what? I'm getting all this dopamine from the outside. I don't need to make my own dopamine. So our brains downregulate production of dopamine, downregulate production of dopamine receptors. And that means, Guy, that when we're not engaging with our drug, we actually go into a dopamine deficit state. We feel depressed. And I think all of us can relate to that, being really engaged in a social media exchange and then having a lot of trouble getting off of it. And then when we stop, kind of feeling bereft or lost or sad or depressed until we go back on again. So that is essentially what happens when we repeatedly use any addictive drug. We downregulate our own dopamine. We need more and more of the drug to get the same effect. We change our reward pathway, and now we need to engage with that drug just to feel any kind of good feeling. And when we're not engaging in the drug, we feel down, anxious, irritable, and depressed.
That's hectic, Anna. It's certainly, it's actually, I mean, it's horrible news. And that's certainly at the individual level, and it's bad enough at the individual level. But you, Randy, on the broader societal issues, it doesn't look that much better. I mean, from your perspective, what are your views on the good and bad of social media for society?
Well, first I'd say glad to be here, and I think what you said about the benefits, I think, are all very well known, right? To keep in touch, to see what our friends and family are up to build movements across the world, right? There's all kinds of beautiful things happening. But I also feel like that side doesn't need any more marketing because everyone knows that stuff. And it's like there's probably tens at least or hundreds of billions of dollars worth of marketing that lets us know that side. And the challenge is what else is going on, right? And there's this idea that the harms are just at the corners, they're just the edge cases. But I think one of the core problems is that the way these platforms are tilted is things tend to slide a certain way. And I think Anna explained brilliantly how social media creates a race for dopamine and reinforcing structures in our own minds. And that same race then translates into addiction, which determines how tightly our brain is plugged into the platforms. And once we're plugged in, there's a lot of other stuff that happens because of the tilt of the platforms. And I'll explain a little more about that, largely due to the business models that they run on. But first, I wanted to touch on a few of the harms. There's a lot more at ledger.humanetech.com. I'll share the links in the chat afterwards. But for example, right, harms to child development. When children are on screen time too much, even at early ages, like 2 to 5, they show delays in development across many cognitive measures. There's challenges with anxiety, depression, and outrage, just like what Anna was talking about. From 2016 to 2019, there's a quadrupling in the number of plastic surgeries with patients undergoing cosmetic surgery for the sake of looking good on social media. There's manipulation to democracies, which we've seen, right? Particularly because Facebook allows you to lie in political ads, which is a terrible idea. And so this idea that you can actually buy ads and manipulate people, target audiences, send specific messages to specific audiences, which may or may not be true, is very dangerous. And then this idea, when we have customized feeds everywhere, everyone ends up with their own reality. And as you heard in that trailer, fake news spreads 6 times faster. Why? Because it has so many degrees of freedom, right? You can say whatever you want, and it's so easy to have those things spread because it's easy to find something that will resonate with someone's mind if you can say anything you want. And the problem is once people read this kind of information, they tend not to change their minds back. So this combination makes it very difficult to tackle the world's biggest problems at a time when we need shared truth more than ever. We're breaking that down and we're siloing everyone into different realities. And if you disagree with someone, the first thing you have to start with is say, okay, what is the first thing we can agree on? Can we agree on anything at all? And then you slowly build from there, right? You learn their views and you understand their opinions. And then you say, okay, here's some facts we can agree on. And we're being robbed of that. And I think that's a huge problem. All of these things existed before. It's not like social media invented them. It's just that it's amplifying them at a scale that's never been seen before. So I think it's worth thinking, if you're in the audience, right, thinking about, well, what are the kinds of harms you've seen? And then the next question is, what allows this to happen? Because it doesn't sound good, right? So you have to say, well, what conditions are enabling this? And as usual, a good way to find the answer is to follow the money, because incentives are always a big clue. And in this case, the business model that the companies run on is a major factor. The companies make money. Most of these products are free, and they make money by selling the ability to nudge your behavior, your next thought to advertisers, right? And the advertisers and the platforms have access to everything you've ever shared in order to do that. So where you live, age, gender, ethnicity, every time you say, what are your favorite books, hobbies, all that is great information that can then be sold to advertisers. And even things you haven't shared explicitly, the algorithms infer about you. They say, oh, well, if they like this combination of things, they're probably left-leaning or they're probably right-leaning. And then the advertisers can choose to target you based on that as well. So it's not just the data, it's also your behaviors. And it's all, there's a lot of access, very powerful access that advertisers get to your brain. So you come to these products with specific goals. You're like, oh, I want to see what's up with Anna, like what's she been up to, right? So you come in with one goal, but actually the product doesn't know that your goal is what your goal is, right? It doesn't know you're here for that reason. And they never ask you that. But instead, what they're trying to do is to fit you in with this other goal, which is their goal, which is to sell your behavior to advertisers. And the goal of the advertisers to figure out their goal is to sell their product to you. So you may think that you are the customer of these platforms, but actually you're the product. You're the thing being sold. Your behavior, your mind, your thoughts is what's being sold. So this business model means that the race for attention dominates the whole social media experience. So, okay. So then let's think about why.
Sorry,
Yeah,
Randy,
sorry.
if I may interrupt. I just very conscious of time. I'm sure we could have very easily have filled 2 or 3 hours on this conversation.
Totally.
But just to be sure, we're hearing, the challenge both at the individual and at the societal level. I think, the next question is, so what do we do about it? So Randy, from a society's perspective, what can we do to begin to guard against these failures, really? I think you could phrase it that way, of social media.
Totally. I think we have to start by understanding that technology is not neutral. It reflects the values, the assumptions, the biases of the people who create it. It also reflects the values, assumptions, and biases of the world that it's dropped into. And also, on top of all of that, interacting with technology changes us. So this is what Anna was talking about, right? And it changes us individually and societally. So with that understanding and saying, okay, we need to address not just the technology, but also the systems outside of it, like the capitalist system, the whole world, right? Like how it's set up. We prioritize growth over anything. That's beyond the scope here. So I'm just going to talk about how do we address the social media platforms, but I want to plant those seeds for you all to think about. So first, it's like we have to think, what is humane technology? And I would say humane technology is technology that actually reduces suffering, like as a focus, as a goal. It's centered on values. It's centered on what values people coming to it are trying to enact and helps them to achieve that. It's sensitive to human nature and our own vulnerabilities that we've evolved into. Again, like Anna said, it builds shared truth instead of dividing us. And it accounts for the unintended consequences that it unleashes on society and tries to minimize those. We're not doing a lot of those things very well right now with our technology. And I would encourage you all to think about, what does humane technology mean to you, right? Looking at that definition, saying, well, how would you extend that? How would you change it? So how do we create the conditions for humane technology? Well, we need pressure from consumers, affect product demand. And this film, which has now been seen by more than 40 million households globally, which is kind of amazing, gives us a real chance to create this kind of demand for different products. We need pressure from policy, protections for consumers, and penalties when companies do the wrong thing. Because these companies are advancing far beyond the ability of policymakers to keep up, right? Technology is advancing exponentially, so it's really hard to keep up. Investor pressure. So investors can change the way money flows in to these companies. So when you actually make, when you want to build technology, right, you need to fund it. So we can control that. And the last one is pressure from technologists themselves inside the companies, who are many of them are very well intended. They want to change things. They don't want to be part of this problem. So we have to change the culture and the way products are built. And that includes understanding the environment that the products will live in. It means we have to understand history, sociology, psychology, biology, and not just technology and how to code. So these are kind of the big pieces. And ultimately, there's of course a conversation about the bigger system. And I think it's good for all of you to think about, what effect do our social and economic systems have? And what changes are needed? What would you do if you had the power to change these systems? What would you do? So I'll post some resources as well in the chat after we're done. And yeah, hand it back to you, guys.
Superb. Thank you very much, Randy. And then from your side, Anna, so we've spoken a little bit about what we do in society involving employers, employees, policymakers, investors. What do we as individuals do? Or what can we as individuals do to just guard ourselves against these the failings that we're hearing about in social media?
Well, what I would love for all of you to try is just a little experiment in your life. And what I'd like to ask you to do is to choose that one social media app or activity that you worry maybe it has more control over you than you have over it. The 3 C's of addiction are out of control use, compulsive use, and continued use despite consequences. So if maybe you said to yourself, I'm only going to go on Instagram for 20 minutes and check one thing, but an hour later you were still on, maybe that's something that's a little bit out of your control. Or maybe you're spending a whole lot of mental energy and time thinking about using. That would be an area that you have to worry about. And then finally, continued use despite consequences. Those consequences can be like, instead of doing your schoolwork, you're on social media. Or instead of sleeping, you're staying up late on social media. Or if it's not social media, maybe it's video games. Maybe it's any site that you go on. I challenge you to abstain from using that app or that social media website, whatever it is, for at least 24 hours and really observe what happens to you, because I suspect what happens to you is the same thing that happens to me, which is I spend about the first 6 hours just thinking about my phone and craving it and kind of wanting to use and having these intrusive thoughts. I got to check it. I got to check it. And that's exactly what people with drug and alcohol addiction, when they experience when they're thinking about their drug of choice. But as the day goes on, I think you'll find that those thoughts get less and less. And by the end of the day, you may even experience some continuous creative new thoughts that aren't related to what you need to go check. So I would love you to do that. Do it with a friend, do it with a family member. The only way that we can really become insightfully aware of how compulsive our use is if we abstain from for a period of time, get out of that cycle of compulsive overconsumption, and then look back and go, wow, I was really engaging in a way that's not consistent with my goals, not consistent with my values, not consistent with how I see myself as a person or how I want to live my life. And then when you re-enter behavior that relates to using that app or that website, put some checks in place. Say, you know what? I'm only going to use for X number of hours per day, or I'm never going to use in my bed, or I'm only going to use that with friends, or I'm only going to connect around that with live humans that I really know, so that my interaction on social media is an extension of my real life relationships. It strengthens those. It's not a substitute for working on my real life relationships. Because really that's the key. We all want connection, right? And connection is good. But when we kind of go down this rabbit hole of connecting in ways that don't strengthen real life connections and real intimacy, then we're going to a bad place. So Guy, that's my suggestion.
Thank you, Anna. And those are really practical. It's pretty easy. Put the phone away, close the social media networks, give it a try, 24 hours. You will, as you say, for that first 6 months, feel a certain level of frustration. I should be looking at what's on WhatsApp.
For 6 hours. If you put it away for 6 months, then you're really a hero.
All right, so let's go for 6 months. But for sure, just give it a try. And in fact, I think the point you're pointing out is be aware of your body's response. Because that's exactly what the issue is. That's exactly the mechanism the creators of this technology are looking for, is that response, and be aware of that response.
Mindfulness is a huge asset here, right? I think cultivating mindfulness, there's lots of programs to help you do that. But it's a huge tool to be aware of your experience, of your thoughts, of your emotions, that sense of liking, not liking that is going on in your mind as you're using the products is a powerful tool. But you have to have enough to match. That's the challenge. You have to work on it because the tools are really powerful, right?
No, they are. And in fact, I think that is probably the single biggest takeaway, mindfulness, not only at the individual level, but at society's level. So in the interest, I think we've got 4 minutes left for any questions. Jay, if I may hand over to you. Are there any questions that have come through for Anna and or Randy?
No questions have come through as of now. Oh, well, here we just got one. With various issues with elections all around the world, it was mentioned that social media was used to use your data in order to be used for advertisements, but couldn't the same thing be said about one's political beliefs? Can these algorithms be used to sway someone's political beliefs in the form of false propaganda?
Absolutely. That's what's happening all the time. I think that's exactly the challenge. And one of the important observations about this particular situation is that the products were used as intended. It's not like someone hacked into something or there were hacks, but in a lot of cases, the products are being used exactly as intended to cause division within countries, between parties, all of this. They're just using all the same tools that normal advertisers use. Like if I want to sell you a shoe, or if I want to switch your political affiliation, the same legal set of tools is used to do that.
Wow. Another question. How do you help children to overcome social media addiction?
Yeah, so the first thing that I advise families to do is to begin to have open discussions together about the fact that social media really can be addictive. Kids need to understand that these are not entirely benign interactions. And if they use it too much, they can get into this dopamine deficit state where the only thing that gives them pleasure is continued use. It's also really important that adults model the behavior they want children to follow. I'll often see families where the parents say, I can't get my kid off his phone. And every 5 minutes, that parent is going on their phone themselves. So we really have to take responsibility and model that behavior. Finally, children need to know that it won't happen naturally that they'll moderate their behavior because the pull is so intense. So we have to put barriers in place in schools, in families. Families can take technology-free days where they do other things together, like go outside, all leaving their devices at home, or even technology-free vacations where no one's allowed to bring their device. So they're forced to actually have to talk to each other, or God forbid, play a board game together. The kinds of things we're forgetting how to do. And I really feel that schools have a very serious responsibility to not just let this technology take over the school and educational system. It's really criminal, and it's also lazy. We've got to make sure schools realize there's a time and a place for these devices, but that kids need to learn social skills. They need to know how to have a continuous, uninterrupted thought. They need to be able to create things.
Mm-hmm. One other really helpful thing is just helping kids, and this works for adults too, see that they're the product, because nobody likes the idea of, hey, wait, people are making money off, I'm being manipulated, right? They're making money off of me. Once that observation, if a kid's old enough, that's really effective because that gets you right at the source. And then after that, all the other things are easier to do because they're aligned now. They're like, oh yeah, I don't want to be part of that.
So thank you. One more question. Is it possible to make sure that none of our data is collected at all?
If you don't want anything to be tailored for you, in order for the whole exchange to work, products need to know about you in order to give you useful recommendations or do useful things, right? If you go to YouTube and you want to learn how to play the guitar, it's really helpful if it knows you want to play the guitar. And you signal that by typing, guitar in the search box, right? Learn how to play guitar. So that some information has to be exchanged. The problem is the companies have been their incentives with that data is not aligned with your incentives in giving that data. And when that trust is broken, the more they have, the more dangerous it is. And this is the fundamental challenge.
Okay. Well, thank you guys. We are sadly out of time. There's more questions, and this is interesting. I'll say that while you were speaking, I deleted Facebook from my phone. So I'm about 15 minutes into this. So far, so good. But I thought that was a great idea. And so here we are, 15 minutes into my addiction treatment, I guess.
Yeah, and Jay, one thing you can do too is just observe what your brain does. Like observe how many times your brain tells you, gotta check it, because that alone speaks to how we're all being rewired.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say it felt funny to do it.
Yes.
Right? Whereas I wouldn't care
dropping into the abyss, right?
If I had deleted my Maps application, I don't think I would have cared. But That was interesting.
We've
Well,
got somebody else somebody else wrote in and said they deactivated their Facebook too. So who knows? Maybe we'll get like a whole challenge today.
yes, fantastic. Well, thank you both, and thank you, Guy, for leading that terrific discussion.
Thanks, Guy. Great job.
Thank you so
Hey,
much,
everybody.
guys. Thank you,
Good
Anna.
job, Andy. I
Thank
learned
you
a
to
lot.
everyone else.